Katerina Yaka watched the German soldiers flee, streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them, she thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Yaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review for May 12th, 2022. Do I have that right? No, it's May 13th. I'm sorry. For May 13th, 2022. This is Chris Driscoll, and along with me is Rainer Shea. Hello, Rainer.
Hello.
How you doing tonight?
I'm doing some organizing with my party locally. We're showing up in support of Roe v. Wade.
Oh, yeah. Roe v. Wade's under attack. Who'd have thunk it after all these years? 1972. Man. All these years later, and we're having to do what we did way back then. Crazy America. Crazy America. Okay, well, let's get started. First on the list tonight, if the U.S. wanted peace in Ukraine. Interesting. This is an interesting article. So, starting off, if the U.S. wanted peace in Ukraine, as we hyperplane down the brink of nuclear Armageddon, while Bono and The Edge play U2 songs in Kiev, it's probably worth taking a moment to highlight how this war could have been avoided. The U.S. could have simply pledged military protection for Volodymyr Zelensky against the far-right extremists who were threatening to lynch him if he enacted the peacemaking policies he was elected president to enact. To be clear, what we are indulging in here is entirely an act of fantasy. We are imagining what would have happened had the U.S. pledged to protect the Ukrainian government from an undemocratic, violent overthrow at the hands of fascists instead of waging a horrific proxy war. In that, we're also imagining a world in which the US government acts in the highest interests of all instead of working continuously to dominate the planet, no matter how much madness and cruelty it inflicts upon humanity. That would be a world in which the US had not been taking steps that it has for so many years to orchestrate this proxy war. With that out of the way, it's just a simple fact that for a fraction of the military firepower the US is pouring into Ukraine right now, it could have prevented the entire war by simply protecting Ukrainian democracy from the undemocratic impulses of the worst people in that country. When asked by the nation's Katrina Hoovel last month what he thinks is preventing Kiev from signing a peace agreement with Russia, John Mearsheimer, whose analysis of this conflict has been prophetic for so many years, replied as follows. I think that when Zelensky ran for president, he made it very clear that he wanted to work out an arrangement with Russia that ended the crisis in Ukraine, and he won. And what he had then tried to do was move towards implementing the Minsk II agreement. If you were going to shut down the conflict in Ukraine, you had to implement Minsk II. And Minsk II meant giving the Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian population in the easternmost part of Ukraine, the Donbass region, a significant amount of autonomy, and you had to make the Russian language an official language of Ukraine. I think Zelensky found out very quickly that because of the Ukrainian right, it was impossible to implement Minsk II. Therefore, even though the French and Germans, and of course the Russians, were very interested in making Minsk II work because they wanted to shut down the crisis, they couldn't do it. In other words, the Ukrainian right was able to stymie Zelensky on that front. When Mearsheimer says that the Ukraine right was able to stymie Zelensky, he doesn't mean by votes or by democratic processes. He means by threats and violence. In an article last month titled Siding with Ukraine's Far Right, U.S. sabotaged Zelensky's mandate for peace. Journalist Aaron Mate wrote the following. In April 2019, Zelensky was elected with an overwhelming 73% of the vote on a promise to turn the tide. In his inaugural address the next month, Zelensky declared that he was not afraid to lose my own popularity, my ratings, and was prepared to give up my own position as long as peace arrives. But Ukraine's powerful right, the neo-Nazi militias, made clear to Zelensky that reaching peace in the Donbass would have a much higher cost. No, he would lose his life, writes sector co-founder Dmytro Yarach. Then the commander of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army responded 1 week after Zelensky's inaugural speech. He will hang on some tree if he betrays Ukraine and those people who died in the revolution and the war. So there you have it. Imagine if the United States wanted peace in Ukraine. Yeah.
This is the kind of hypocrisy that is being noticed by the majority of the world. And the fact that most of the world does not see the United States as credible when it comes to Ukraine and is consequently not participating in the sanctions on Russia, this is a reality that is acknowledged by the US media. I just found a foreign policy article, a foreign policy publication, which was pointing out how most of the world is not seeing the Biden administration as credible, not cooperating with it, because of the United States hypocrisy for the last several decades, at least as they frame it. Honestly, for the entire existence of the United States, the U.S. has not upheld its supposed values of democracy and respect for international sovereignty. It's invaded countless nations, and its own so-called democracy is increasingly visible as a sham. And when you look deeper into it, you also find this reality about a 2014 U.S. perpetrated coup, where the CIA has since been backing neo-Nazi terrorists as a consequence of that coup, as in the coup enabled the terror backing. So even though the U.S. media is not going to acknowledge
that was in Ukraine. You might want to point out that was in Ukraine.
It was in Ukraine. And even though the media won't acknowledge these deeper realities, just the great visibility of hypocrisy is enough to make it all too obvious to pretty much everybody, besides the Biden team itself, that Washington is failing to win over most of the world due to its own lack of moral integrity.
Yes, well put, well put. I couldn't add anything to that. Next on the list, why U.S. inequities and racial injustices have made a U.S. civil war inevitable.
There's anthropological evidence, no, I could say sociological evidence, for the idea that within our generation, most likely, there's going to be some sort of civil conflict within this country over the intensifying violence against marginalized communities. And we, of course, need to make clear that the violence is going to be provoked by the state, not by these communities. The communities are going to be proportionately responding to the intensifying police brutality. It's intensifying because of the increasing militarization of the police, Israelification of the police as well, with the Israelis training the police. And these trends are going to get more prevalent. That's going to result in insurgency. At least that's what they'll call it. Really, it'll be ultimately a counterinsurgency against the war that the state has been waging against marginalized peoples in this country. It'll be justified for the same reason that the Palestinian struggle is justified. And the reason I believe this is inevitable is because it's not like the Democratic or Republican Party going to course on their love for the cops. Biden keeps talking about funding the police, despite these contradictions that have appeared or been made so undeniable during these last couple of years. Kamala is driving forward this trend towards militarization, even if in a relatively passive way. And this is going to have blowback.
Yes, The top cop, they call her, Kamala.
Yeah.
The top cop. Yeah. I see this as inevitable, unless we carry out a socialist revolution beforehand. Civil war in America is inevitable. It's just what you say. It's inevitable. It's coming. It's coming down the pike. And why? Because the American state is attacking Black people, brown people, poor people, attacking them in such a way that a response is inevitable, and a response is coming. It is inevitable. Next on the list, Ukraine, the power of an idea, the PR president. More on Zelensky here. How about that? This is really a whole, at least all my contributions are about Zelensky in one way or another. So get used to it. No matter what anyone's feelings are regarding the rights and wrongs of Russia's actions in Ukraine, and you guys all know that my feelings are that Russia's actions were absolutely necessary, and they were pushed upon Russia by the Americans and their toadies in NATO. Anyway, Russia's actions in Ukraine, you have to admire the success of the public relations campaign behind Volodymyr Zelensky, the level and supreme coordination of the unlimited support he has received and achieved across Europe is unprecedented. At its source is the power of a single idea that in this wicked old world of ours, there is still an antiseptic and clear division between good and evil. This idea has almost unlimited mileage in this world, which was previously ever rapidly moving towards total cynicism. Like Live Aid in the 80s, the cause of Ukraine has allowed for a vast upsurge in idealism, a cleansing of the soul by a cathartic anger combined with compassionate grief. Western humanity has taken Ukraine to its heart, oblivious to any warts that may be transferred in the process. No, it's warts and all till death do us part, a marriage of ceremony blessed by every liberal institution across the Western world. In furtherance of this marriage comes the weaponry to protect it, a sworn duty to assist in the defeat of all those who would tear this great union apart. Blessed by every high priest that can be found, and all those of the secular variety who have newly wiped the blood of the Iraqis, Syrians, Afghans, and Libyans from their raiments, to be born again, cleansed by the holy public relations of total unquestioned belief in their communal rightness. It is said that up to 100 public relations companies have been set to work devising strategies and campaigns to deliver the truth about every aspect concerning Saint Zelensky and his acolytes, his handmaidens and supplicants. Every move he makes is choreographed with a precision usually accorded to the high and mighty of this world, and to a far greater extent even than those illustrious figures. Technology has been brought to bear in every aspect of the bringing of Zelensky's holy word to an adoring public who hang on his every word. Politicians of all descriptions go dewy-eyed at the mere mention of his name. The only personality that could possibly do better and inspire such an outpouring of devotion would be JC himself, come down on his fiery chariot to smite the heathens who besmirch his holy name. For yes, this is a crusade. A mighty army has been recruited, indeed has volunteered. Such is the popularity, the public relations success of Mr. Z, that the entire panoply of great liberal beats of the political, cultural, commercial, and social worlds constantly arrive at his feet to touch his hem, or perhaps his trouser bottoms. But that doesn't quite have the same ring to it, does it?
Yes, it's a lot
Meanwhile, well,
like,
anyway, I got a little bit more. Meanwhile, in the rather more real world, the Russian military grinds slowly forward, tackling each massively fortified village, town, and city one by one in northern Lugansk and the vicinity of Donetsk city. Papasnaya, a city of some 20,000 in normal times, gateway to more northerly, much larger combinations of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk has fallen to the Russians. Expert analysts say that these two will fall given time, perhaps a month or a month and a half from now. Russian forces will then descend on the last remaining Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Donetsk city, and they will be eliminated also. And that will be it. Game over. The entirety of the Donbass will be secure, one of the prime objectives of the Russian campaign. When it is realized that Russia has permanently removed a great chunk from Ukraine, I imagine there will be a brief wrinkling of the brows and sturdy words of never-ending support for the sovereignty of Ukraine, and so forth. But the brave willies of the West will certainly do nothing more than pout. Okay, that's it.
wow, it's pretty absurd. It's a personality cult that they've created around this seemingly random dude. I mean, the only reason that he is revered is because he just so happened to have become president. He used to be a comedian, and I'm guessing that was part of his political brand, part of his appeal. Using position in the media to elect himself, not based on his actual credentials, not based on his history of helping the well-being of the Ukrainian people, obviously. And it's predictable that he was able to succeed in a political environment that had been drastically upended by the forces of right-wing ultra-nationalism. I mean, the Communist Party had already been outlawed by the time he became president. So they were being pushed to the side, and then somebody like him was able to come in, and then he was so easily able to be, you could say, molded by these crazy neo-Nazi forces. and then he was turned into this figurehead to represent whatever liberals want him to be. It's very strange. It's very odd, but it's going to amount to nothing because Ukraine is going to lose. And like you say, they're not going to be able to stage some kind of comeback. All that they're going to be able to do is pout. Though we still shouldn't underestimate the destructive potential of the imperialists, because along with this pouting is going to come even more racism against both Russians, as we've been seeing, and against Chinese, more Asians in general, because they don't specify that. This is going to be an increasingly dark paradigm in terms of race relations that imperialism is going to cultivate within the core imperialist countries, all out of reaction to this loss of hegemony.
Yeah. Next on the list, North Korea isn't totalitarian. It shows how we in the U.S. can develop towards socialism.
I say this because it provides an example of a country first throwing off colonialism and then developing towards socialism. And Vietnam is another example of this, of course. It had multiple colonial occupiers. But I hone in on North Korea because North Korea is so widely considered in the U.S. to be the most evil country on earth, pretty much. You'd ask most Americans and they think it's a nightmare. But the irony is it provides a model, though not an exact model, obviously, for the path that we're going to need to take to liberate ourselves. That path being first throw off colonialism, then build socialism. But there's where I think we need to have a serious discussion about the nature of the decolonial movement in this country. Because I've mentioned land back before, and you pushed back against that. And now I see why, because I realize that land back doesn't say enough, as in what's going to happen after the land is returned. The conclusion that I'm increasingly coming to is we're going to need to build a federation of post-colonial nations that collaborate towards building socialism on this continent. And this will obviously not look exactly like just returning full jurisdiction to the tribes, though that's going to be probably an initial part of it. What's then going to have to happen is a negotiation between these First Nations and the other oppressed nationalities, like African nation. For many decades, there's been a project to create a Republic of New Africa, for instance, and the Chicano nation is going to need to be part of that negotiation as well. It's going to have to be complicated, but of course it will need to be, because we're in the core of imperialism. We're living in a country that's founded on settler colonial genocide, and we're going to need to figure out the contradiction. So it's going to be more complicated than it was in the Korean Peninsula, but ultimately I believe that both all of the Korean Peninsula and all of this continent will be free from colonialism and capitalism.
I hope so. I don't know. I have no crystal ball. I don't know how the socialist revolution will envelop North America. I just know that it will. And how it does, all the peculiars and particulars, I guess we're going to see. Next on the list, how Ukraine's Jewish President Zelensky made peace with neo-Nazi paramilitaries on the front lines of the war with Russia. Let's see if I can find it here. Here we go. Azov has been formally incorporated. That is, the Azov Battalion has been formally incorporated into the Ukrainian military, and its street vigilante wing, known as the National Corps, was deployed across the country under the watch of the Ukrainian Interior Ministry and alongside of the National Police. In December 2021, Zelensky would be seen delivering a Hero of Ukraine award to a leader of the fascistic right sector in a ceremony in Ukraine's parliament. A full-scale conflict with Russia was approaching, and the distance between Zelensky and the extremist paramilitaries was closing fast. As February 24th, February 24th, when President Vladimir Putin sent troops into Ukrainian territory on a stated mission to demilitarize and denazify the country, U.S. media embarked on a mission of its own to deny the power of neo-Nazi paramilitaries over their country's military and political sphere. As the U.S. government funded national public radio insisted, Putin's language about denazification is offensive and actually wrong. That's what they said. In its bid to deflect from the influence of Nazism in contemporary Ukraine, the U.S. media has found its most effective PR tool in the figure of Zelensky, a former TV star and comedian from a Jewish background. It is a role the actor turned politician has eagerly assumed. But as we will see, Zelensky has not only ceded ground to the neo-Nazis in his midst, he has entrusted them with the frontline role in his country's war against pro-Russian and Russian forces. Raised in a non-religious Jewish family in the Soviet Union during the 1980s, Zelensky has downplayed his heritage in the past. The fact that I am Jewish barely makes 20 in my long list of faults, he joked during a 2019 interview in which he declined to go into further detail about his religious background. Today, as Russian troops bear down on cities like Mariupol, which is effectively under the control of the Azov Battalion, Mariupol is now totally in Russian hands. Zelensky is no longer ashamed to broadcast his Jewishness. He's a newfound Jew. He's all of a sudden found his Jewishness, which he used to say was number 20 on his list of aspects of himself. How could I be a Nazi? He wondered aloud during a public address. For a U.S. media engaged in an all-out information war against Russia, the president's Jewish background has become an essential public relations tool. There's more to that. There's a lot more to that article, but these are just some highlights that I picked out for people. I urge everybody to look at the article itself, which we will have a link to in underneath our presentation tonight. You can find it. Sorry, go ahead.
It's identity politics, another aspect of this personality cult that they've created. And it's definitely suspect that they would focus so much on his being Jewish. because if the neo-Nazi presence is really so insignificant, then why do they feel the need to play that up so much? Obviously, they claim it's because the prevalence of Russian propaganda, but really all that Russian propaganda is doing is pointing out these glaring truths about how Ukraine has been during these last 10 years.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, for our last point, 21st century fascism, the bid for survival by a dying capitalist order. Rainer Shea, take it away.
There's something so ominous about this wave of anti-abortion and anti-LGBT laws that we've been seeing. Not just that, but laws that go against proper education on what this country's history is, what this country's recent history is. There is this extremely sinister campaign to blot out, whitewash, erase every aspect of reality that the far right in this country wishes did not exist. They don't want to acknowledge that transgender people exist. They don't want to acknowledge that abortion is an issue which should be taken seriously instead of simplified in this bizarre way. They don't want to acknowledge that institutional racism exists, or even that it's existed to the extent that actual experts agree it has existed throughout American history. This is an unusually aggressive point within the Republican Party, even relative to the last several decades. It's so aggressive that just a year or so into the post-Trump era, where the Republican Party destroyed itself and got the Democrats thoroughly back into power, the Republicans are able to come back in full force. Not even come back, just continue escalating their backlash against reality. And this is not the type of conservatism that they claim it is. They call themselves conservatives, but really all along they've been proto-fascists, and they're becoming increasingly fascist, which makes me think of Umberto Eco, who wrote a generation ago that the fascism of the next generation is going to appeal to the frustrated middle class in countries like America. It's going to appeal to people just like the people who voted for Trump. It's going to appeal to their paranoia over losing their status in society. And the people who are going to get hurt are the most vulnerable.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I want to point out, too, we heard over and over again in 2016 and in 2017 about how the white working class elected Trump. Well, the facts are quite different. The statistics show that 71% of those who voted for Trump were, in fact, middle class people, not working class people. It was a minority, probably less than 1/3 of working class people who voted for Trump. The majority, a clear, sizable majority of middle class people voted for Trump. Yeah, and you're absolutely correct. This is a big part of the 21st century fascism. This, like the attack on abortion rights, as I was saying earlier in the show, something that we haven't even had to think about since 1972. And here we are defending abortion again. It's insane. And similarly for trans people, gay people, people who we haven't had to worry about for a long time because they had their rights. But now it's like a new onslaught against these people just for what they're born as. It's disgusting. It is truly a fascistic, a kind of 21st century fascism.
Right. Well, I feel like it's a little bit more complicated in terms of the LGBT issue because LGBT people in this country have never really had their full rights. I think it has to do with the fact that there's more LGBT self-assertion, more visibility for these groups. They're asserting their right to exist, and the right is not wanting to let that come to completion. They're wanting to bring things back to the way that they were maybe a couple of decades ago. The same way that they wanted to destroy the Black liberation movement, the civil rights movement, when it was still a question whether Black people had the right to go to the same school as white people. History is essentially repeating itself, whereas back then it was a serious question whether civil rights for Black people could come about. Now it's a serious question whether civil rights for transgender people especially can come about. And we're seeing the kinds of monsters of history that Gramsci talked about. He talked about how in between the old era and the new, better era, there's a time of monsters. And the monsters are the people who want to make trans people disappear.
Yeah, well put, well put. Okay, well, that's it for us tonight. Want to thank you, Rainer, for your typical fabulous work. Thank everyone for tuning in, for watching the show. And we want to invite you all to come back again next week when we will have another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. Until then, I bid you a sweet adieu.